free market experiment has been carried out for a few hundred years at this point. The results of it have been ever-diminishing degrees of autonomy in our personal lives, as well as a growing underclass who are barely able to achieve subsistence and who will be left without property for the rest of their lives. Globalization, driven by the profit motive, has led to the collapse of nation-states and various demographic crises. Every word you say on the internet is monitored and censored by massive woke corporations, and the power of political economy is now being leveraged to control your thoughts. In the future, due to the unrestrained expansion of technology, this censorship will happen directly in your own brain. Companies are being brought up and centralized into giant monopolies. Billionaire global capitalists like Bill Gates are buying up and centralizing farmland, denying it to the people. Eventually, we'll be dependent on big capital to survive, almost akin to the way people were dependent on the totalitarian government under the Soviet Union. The dangers of unrestrained markets are quite evident. There are, to my mind, two solutions to the issue. The first is to return to the style of pre-modern economies by setting up a guild system and requiring businesses to be chartered by the state. If a business hurts human autonomy or upsets society in any way, this charter can be revoked. What could also be implemented is distributism, which allows the government to divide wealth and land among the people, guaranteeing the small landowner and proprietor state that people like conservatives really want deep down, but which cannot exist under the monopolizing and centralizing conditions of capitalism. The other solution, which I think is more practical in the modern age, is some form of socialism, albeit in a nationalist and non-Marxian schema. Businesses would be required to join what amounts to state-run unions, which regulate the way they conduct business and serves as a liaison between workers, owners, and the state. Wealth would be redistributed, allowing the underclass to live more comfortably and helping out those who cannot work, as well as keeping the bourgeoisie in check. The power of the bourgeoisie would be subordinated under the state rather than practically controlling the state as they do in the free market. Questions like access to healthcare and education would be solved, and as a side note, you can even imagine socialist monarchy as a bridge between these two methods, which is certainly not impossible. Of course, conservatives and certain liberal people on the right will object to socialism. They, having individualist priors, believe that something like wealth redistribution is unfair to rich individuals. The common weal essentially does not exist for them, so the question of helping the poor is simply left up to individual volition, or worse, left in the hands of the poor themselves to pull up by their bootstraps. I've already spoken elsewhere how the individualist attitude is invalid. Individuals are persons, so they are a part of collective society. Their interrelations form a compelling basis to treat people as components of the whole, not merely as isolated egos. The expectation that the poor should pull themselves up by the bootstraps is absurd because wealth is mostly a consequence of inheritance and luck. Studies on the correlation between IQ and income show that it's only about 0.4, which is far lower than one might expect if personal achievement were the primary determinant of wealth. Similarly, succeeding in the professional sector is a consequence of getting lucky and knowing the right people. Simply getting a college degree, whether it was paid for by you or the government, does not guarantee a high-income job or any job at all. Entry-level positions notoriously require several years' worth of experience, and the only real way to get such a job is to already know someone and have it lined up for you. The number of available paths for a poor person looking to pull themselves up by their bootstraps is really quite limited, and often people are in geographic locations like the Rust Belt where opportunities are simply not available. It's very cheap and easy to say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but considerably harder to actually do in practice. It is not at all a solution to poverty. And of course, the most heartless of conservatives will complain about useless people, lazy people who don't want to work, and so on. The reality is that the number of people who are perfectly capable of work but who do not engage in it is so small that it's really negligible. Most people who are NEETs usually have some pre-existing problem that prevents them from working, whether that be depression, lack of opportunity, problems with social skills, and so on. There's a compelling case to be made that there is really no such thing as a lazy person. People become lazy for underlying reasons, which means that being lazy is not necessarily their fault. So yes, perhaps we should give welfare to those who don't want to work. It might not even be their fault. They are humans, and like all installed humans, they deserve to be valued to some extent simply because they're human. The theomorphic nature of man disallows us from viewing it otherwise. I also want to point out how much of a self-owned capitalism is to conservatism because it, in part, drives wokeness. Capitalism incentivizes broadening markets as much as possible, so it becomes advantageous to capitalists to try to market products across gender lines. For example, the traditional market for video games in the US has been young white men. To make more profit, companies would want to expand this market to non-whites as well as women. So part of the solution is to include non-whites and women in the video games with representation as well as marketing. Transgenderism also may be promoted to some degree because it allows companies to market beauty products to men. And I should also mention that something like anti-androgens and estrogen are also profitable due to transgender people. So capitalists have an incentive to promote transgenderism to expand the market for these things. Elsewhere, we could even see attempts at cross-gender marketing on companies like Manscaped, who are providing personal grooming equipment to a male audience, including such things as lotions and skin cream that ordinarily only women would buy. It's also worth noting that it is advantageous to capitalists to try to break up as much organic solidarity in society as possible to prevent mass resistance to its power. If people have prior identities to capital, like race, religion, sex, and so on, then they are less manipulable by capital. They will resist doing the bidding of capital when it butts up against their prior values and identities. But strip away all but the most arbitrary identity, and you simply become an individual atom that can be placed into whatever role capital desires. This might be the reason why capital promotes so much transsexualism, homosexuality, and other non-standard lifestyles. They want to alienate you from your family and society so you can be controlled by them. Similarly, racial diversity is a natural fault line that destroys labor movements. Companies exploit the fact that humans have in-group preference to destroy the possibility of unionization. An Amazon study found that warehouses that were more diverse were less likely to unionize, so they decided that they should diversify their warehouses as much as possible so they could continue oppressing their workers. Only a homogeneous front against capitalism, based on prior identities, could possibly be effective, and they know it. Diversity is also driven by a desire for cheap labor from the third world, especially from places like India, on the behalf of capitalists. This is why Republican politicians are so much in favor of H-1B visas and legal immigration. Again, it's a conservative self-own to hitch American nationalism to capitalism. Another domain in which capitalism is antithetical to conservatism is in the domain of art. Conservatives are very meritocratic and want the best art to succeed in the market. However, often what we find is that good art remains niche, while bland and poorly made art is more popular among the masses. Capitalism essentially requires that art follows the desires and whims of the masses rather than genuine artistic genius, since the profit motive simply incentivizes capitalists to produce that which is most widely sold. This also involves potentially manipulating customers. For example, as I explained in my video, The Silence Behind the Game Industry's Downward Spiral, video games use engagement optimization to manipulate players into playing the game longer and making microtransaction purchases. This does not make the game as a form of art any more compelling, but it does make it more profitable. The artistic output of capitalism is essentially just Call of Duty and Marvel movies. And now that wokeness is officially a fixture of capitalist society, all media produced by major corporations pushes woke left-wing values, partly for their own cynical purposes, and partly due to the cultural hegemony of leftism. Now let's address government spending. Conservatives want small government that remains uninvolved in the economy because they fear negative economic outcomes from different levels of planning. A big government can become totalitarian, they say, so it's better to allow the poor to suffer than to enslave them under a strong central state. But to this I would say that the market would enslave them anyway. In the power vacuum left by the night watchman state, corporations will grab up all available claims to human freedom and subordinate all workers to their values and directives. This happened at the turn of the century when companies paid employees in coupons to prevent them from saving enough wealth to switch jobs, gave them company lodgings, and forced them to buy goods from the company's store. If allowed to, capitalism would turn free citizens into serfs for the sake of exclusivizing profits and squeezing as much labor value out of them as possible. We already see them practically doing this at the upper end of business by making employees sign non-compete clauses and NDAs. It's only due to government regulation, that big bad government intervention, that this does not happen with the working class anymore. Government spending itself can be a massive problem. I agree with the conservatives that money printing for the sake of government spending leads to inflation, which harms the economy for everyone. But obviously it's not necessary to print money to help out the poor and disabled. We can simply tax the rich more greatly instead, who have such a surplus of profit that they cannot possibly even spend it all. However, conservatives are absolutely opposed to taxes on the wealthy. I might go as far as to accuse conservatives of being callous because of their rejection of the welfare and wealth redistribution, and it basically just comes down to the fact that income redistribution impinges on the profits of billionaires who do nothing but hoard their wealth. The working class nor middle class would be harmed by increased levels of taxation on the very richest people, assuming that rates of taxation are not so high that they would cause capital flight. Then we have another issue, which is that socialist revolutions did actually nearly succeed around the world. From the beginning of the 20th century up to around the 1920s and 30s, there's spontaneous syndicalist movements popping up in Europe and in the United States. Syndicalism was growing in popularity, boasting hundreds of thousands of members in some countries. In countries like Italy, socialists actually did manage to win control of the country. The conditions of unregulated capitalism were so brutal that it inspired widespread revolt against it, and the only reason this was put to bed was due to government reforms of the market and working conditions. Conservatives are simply not aware of how vital these reforms and regulations are to the stability of the capitalist system, so much so that Marxists would regard them as reactionary. A quick review of the conditions laborers were suffering under in the earlier stages of industrial capitalism reveals precisely why these revolts came to a head and why these reforms were necessary. Marx and Capital shows how in England from 1830 to 1860, factories were working people for up to 15 hours, employing children as young as 6, providing either no time at all or only 30 minutes for lunch breaks, shortening people's lifespans to around 30 or 40 years of age, causing workplace injuries due to unsafe working environments, and terribly underpaying laborers. All this was also generally true during the Gilded Age of the 1910s and 20s. Again, it took widespread reforms to solve this problem and put the unrest to bed. Conservatives, if we take their philosophy to its logical conclusion, want to undo all of these reforms and regulations, which would essentially be suicidal for conservatism. Capitalism indeed is exploitative. I may not agree with Marx's labor theory of value, and so I don't think that the sole way capitalists make profit is by underpaying workers for the full extent of the working day. But I do think that capitalism remains exploitative in other ways. For example, in any low-tier job, you'll be punished for enjoying even the slightest bit of downtime. You are pushed to be as productive as possible at all times, even if your pay does not properly compensate the intensity of your work. Capitalism has an incentive to consume labor as much as possible rather than to preserve it, as Marx stated, and you, as a worker, essentially cease being human. You are merely capital, and the capitalist will dispense with you however he wishes. You are merely machinery to be used up, burnt up, exhausted. And all the while, your company will try to pay you as little as it can possibly afford and give you only the most meager raises, such as a few cents, as an incentive to keep you working as hard as possible. Your need for rest, recuperation, entertainment, or diversion is not whatsoever respected by the capitalists. Unlike in medieval times, there's no such thing as a midday nap or a visit to the tavern. You're expected to carry out an ascesis of labor until you're off the clock, and increasingly, companies are trying to intrude into what you do off the clock as well. And the whole time, the product of your labor is alienated from you and sold to the faceless masses without a single personal stamp of your labor being present on the work. In the Middle Ages, manufacturers would often put a mark on finished goods they could be identified by. Today, you are a faceless automaton who receives no credit for his work. It all just comes down to labor and productivity, because that's all you are to a capitalist. That's how capitalist society views and evaluates you. That's the whole point of class. If you are not productive or you suck at labor, you're useless. You're a bum. Society thinks more highly of a dog who does not labor nor produce than of you. That's what capitalism is. This, though, brings us to another problem in the debate. Regularly, socialist policies are rebutted by conservatives on the basis of the behavior of capitalists in response to these policies. If taxes are too high, they will flee the country. If the minimum wages increase, they will hire fewer employees, which will grow the unemployed underclass. If the workday is cut shorter, they will simply pay people less money and fewer benefits to compensate for the loss in productivity. If working conditions are required to be safer, then they will increase the cost of products to compensate for the inconveniences. Every one of these arguments is not a defense of the free market, but rather an implicit indictment of the bourgeoisie who care more for their self-benefit and profiteering than the good and well-being of society. It's true that if you insist on having human freedom in a market economy, these factors need to be considered. The alternative would be to ban immigration or have the state take over an industry directly or implement some kind of policy like juche. But simultaneously, the problems with socialism are really only so many problems with the bourgeoisie, who, if their character were different, or perhaps if they would accept subjection to a higher power than themselves, might accept personal loss for the greater good. I believe that this is possible if there were ever to be a return of the sacral principle behind production. As long as the purpose of the economy is simply to chase profits rather than to serve God's people, the bourgeoisie will continue to be a hostile force. Class cooperation requires a massive reorientation of values, which was the mistake of the National Socialists and Fascists, who simply wanted to retain modern values whilst attempting to rearrange class relations. As Evelyn's theory of the regression of the castes posits, the very character of the people declines as the age progresses. If a restoration is at all to be possible, then this decline must be reversed in the domain of principle and values, particularly among the bourgeoisie. Further, it is said that wealth redistribution is unfair to rich individuals. However, what conservatives fail to consider is that the working class people must labor 8 to 12 hours a day for mere subsistence income, and this is unfair vis-a-vis the fact that billionaires can make massive profits merely by investing their capital, which they in all likelihood simply inherited. It turns out that either situation is unfair to the individual, so whether we choose capitalism or socialism is basically a product of personal opinion and which class we value. I've already shown how the conservative betrays that he does not believe in the common weal, so socialism remains the superior option for those who genuinely care about their own people. Another conservative argument against socialism is that socialism results in economic and government inefficiencies. The argument goes that an inefficient economy is bad because the total amount of profit declines, and this is supposed to be bad because, allegedly, profits drive innovation. Now, of course, the degree to which we value innovation, assuming that profit drives innovation in the first place, which is something we'll get to in a bit, is basically a personal question. Innovation does not necessarily mean that innovation is good for society or the individual. In fact, in many ways, competition and the profit motive incentivize capitalists to innovate not in providing novel goods and services, but rather in rearranging distribution of goods and services in the service of profits. For example, the benefit of subscription-based streaming services was supposed to be that you pay only for what you want, so it can be cheaper than cable. But since streaming services are so segregated, you end up having to pay for several at once to watch the shows you want. So it ends up being just as expensive as cable again, while companies basically force you to pay for all the shows you don't want to watch anyway, just so you can pay for the ones that you do. Likewise, in, for example, cars with smart features, companies are finding ways to charge you money for features that just would have been a default part of buying the car in the first place. There are proposals to charge money for the use of the radio, to charge money for full access to the actual horsepower of the car, and proposals to charge money for heating and cooling on a subscription basis. This is really the kind of innovation that the profit motive drives, not necessarily technical innovation. And I also question whether the profit motive even truly drives innovation at all, considering that competition causes companies to simply provide versions of the exact same product that already exists on the market in an attempt to grab up market share, i.e. every fast food chain now offers some kind of spicy chicken sandwich, which is barely different from any other sandwich. All products are now kind of just homogenized because they're competing for the same market space. If we really wanted an efficient economy in terms of innovation, we would want to somehow incentivize innovation in areas that are actually novel, like technological frontiers, not areas that are already covered in some way. Capitalism has shown that it is incapable of achieving this, and so this argument from efficiency fails to find any ground. In regard to government efficiency does not in any way help out the people. The only purpose of government efficiency is austerity, and austerity does not serve the working class. It may really only serve the upper class by way of making tax reductions possible, but I would argue that the real threat to the middle class, which conservatives champion, is actually capitalism. Industries are regularly being monopolized, wages are being undercut by cheap foreign labor through immigration driven by capitalistic globalization, and it is being proven in real time Bertrand de Jouvenel's theory of the high and the low versus the middle. An inefficient government is not the cause of the suffering of the middle class, who are in truth still not even all that highly taxed. Then we get the conservative argument that capitalism preserves meritocracy. Meritocracy is supposed to be a system in which people with the very best qualities rise to the top of society. However, capitalism is actually an inverse form of meritocracy. Capitalism promotes acquisitiveness, cupidity, manipulation, dishonesty, and exploitation. Those who are better in any of these categories rise to the top versus the principled people, like conservatives, who always stay near the bottom. This is perhaps the reason why middle-class urban professionals are all left-wing, mainly because they lack any serious principles and slot into the capitalist system very neatly. If you're not willing to grift and exploit people due to your own sense of honor, you're not going to rise to the top of an inverted meritocracy. A real meritocracy is aristocracy, where principles like honor and honesty determine your worth rather than your wealth. Wealth is a poor metric by which to judge the superiority of anyone. It would be more proper to, as happens under an aristocracy, to allot greater wealth to those who are already superior in principle and in value, rather than to allow it to accumulate in the hands of the bourgeoisie. The truth of the matter is that conservatives, despite adhering to capitalism, do not themselves prosper under capitalism. This contradiction is regularly pointed out by leftists who argue that conservative members of the working class are voting against their own interests. I would argue that this also extends to the middle class, who are essentially voting in favor of their own replacement by Indians who have fewer qualms about morality than they do. Conservatives are so blindsided by the threat to their own prosperity and inheritance from the left that they fail to appreciate the degree to which their position is threatened from the capitalist right. Capitalism serves to prop up an oligarchy. Conservatives want a democracy, but what they get from the upper class is essentially control of politics by money. The number of candidates who are allowed to actually run is determined by the degree to which the wealthy will donate to them, and parties are always very cognizant of which candidates will be popular among the wealthy. As such, you will never find a seriously traditionalist candidate running for office, since tradition upsets the atomized state of society that is most conducive to capitalism. All conservative candidates who run will gradually become more liberal as time goes on, because the market and the people who control it are trending leftward. Since politics is driven by the market rather than the other way around, there's no way out of this problem. National Socialism and Fascism made a point of subordinating the economy to the political, while capitalism insists on just having it the other way around, much to the disadvantage of staunch conservatives. These jet-setting, globalist, rootless cosmopolitans get to control everything, while the family man, no matter how much of a pretense he makes to bourgeois values, is left behind and disenfranchised. If you really cared about the family, why would you support a system that keeps dad away from his kids for 10 hours a day? Why would you support a system that, by alienating the husband away from his wife, disrupts and destroys families? Again, the conservative point of view shows that its social values butt up against its economic values. The only solution to this problem is socialism. It is also worth addressing the question of collectivism. Conservatives regularly reject collectivism because they believe that it has led to the worst atrocities of the 20th century, mainly communism and its death toll of somewhere around 88 million. But it's absurd to just reject collectivism because a consistent feature of human sociality is the formation of persons into collectives or groups. Perhaps what they mean to say is that Marxist collectivism should be rejected, because there is, of course, the nationalist definition of collectivism, which is non-Marxian. Marx erred in viewing the people as an amorphous mass rather than a collection of persons. This led to the worst excesses of communist socialism, such as collective farms, the confiscation of private property, and the careless disposal of human beings in pursuit of radical projects and reforms. This is called vulgar collectivism, which tends to see the people merely as a tool for the state. On the other hand, proper collectivism views the people and their well-being as an end in and of itself. It is not faceless. On the contrary, it elevates the personality and respects it without in any way devolving into liberal egoism. It is not the leveling of differences, but rather it is simply the recognition of the social nature of the state and economy, a situation of interconnections and dependencies. Wherever an individual's wants transgress upon the well-being of the collective, the state intervenes in favor of society. Thus, a billionaire's desire to endlessly hoard profits must give way to the poor's need for food and housing. The poor and disabled must be protected, the other classes respected, but above all, one must be ready to sacrifice in order to guarantee the common weal. All this takes place under the collective of a given people in a single integrity. That's the meaning of non-Marxian socialism, not equality, but commonality. What I propose is not the same as National Socialism per se, as it shared the same tendencies of communism to sacrifice people for the sake of the state. It was also too proletarian, emphasizing the struggle of workers over the cultivation of higher values and class cooperation. It was also quite secular, lacking any kind of sacred orientation. We should not allow socialism to be tied down by history and all the various prejudices that people have about it. Socialism has evolved and can evolve to suit the particular situation it finds itself in. One of the worst problems with National Socialism is that it tended to view the disabled as useless eaters and it either executed or sterilized them. It also sought to execute deviants and the mentally ill, which was also quite terrible. A real socialism must recognize the validity of every human being as an ensouled creation of God, without compromising in its nationalism nor traditionalism. The craze of secular revolution that washed over the 20th century was, I think, the sufficient factor in the atrocities of that era. A lack of respect for the human form and the formation of political idols led to unconscionable treatment of human beings. Real socialism must be a religious socialism if it is to avoid being like its prior instantiations. It might simply look like a nationalist version of Sweden, or perhaps it could be corporatist. No matter how it turns out, it must avoid the excesses of the period that came before it. I care about my people, and I want to help every single last one of them. Love for your people and socialism should really be synonymous, and unlike the left, we do not have to become ethno-masochists in pursuit of helping the poor and the underprivileged. I think providing for people who cannot provide for themselves is a very noble and Christian goal, and socialism, if not some form of distributism, accomplishes this well.